So in today's episode, I'm joined by Grossman of the Training Stimulus. The Training Stimulus is a methodology based around optimising exercise mechanics and anatomy, and I don't think I've met anyone better than Ash at taking quite complex topics often and putting them into some of the best analogies I've ever heard. I've learned so much from him in terms of improving my programming and exercise selection and execution for clients, as well as just how I view kind of the bigger picture of training. So thank you very much for joining me today, Ash, to talk about some quite important topics.
Very kind of you. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. One of the conversations I like to have with my clients is for them to make a personal decision on the sliding scale of where's their personal importance from absolute maximum competitive performance. Like, do you want to go to the CrossFit Games and sacrifice a lot to get every last ounce of performance out of yourself? Or are you here to live a nice quality of life and live as long as possible, be as healthy as possible?
So in today's episode, I'm joined by Grossman of the Training Stimulus. The Training Stimulus is a methodology based around optimising exercise mechanics and anatomy, and I don't think I've met anyone better than Ash at taking quite complex topics often and putting them into some of the best analogies I've ever heard. I've learned so much from him in terms of improving my programming and exercise selection and execution for clients, as well as just how I view kind of the bigger picture of training. So thank you very much for joining me today, Ash, to talk about some quite important topics.
That's very kind of you. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you, mate. So I think we both kind of agree, and we've spoken off air, that there's almost a bit of a problem in the industry at the moment. It started off as a really positive movement where like more and more people are getting into this functional training, if you want for a better word.
Yep.
Women in particular, which is great. You know, they're signing up for CrossFit competitions, high rocks, Spartan races, or even just strength training in general. And there are some problems that have occurred as a result of that, isn't there?
Yeah.
Where that's maybe gone a little bit too far. So it's something that I'm seeing more and more of over the last couple of years. And I know you are as well. So I think that's a really important conversation to have. So yeah, thank you for joining me today to get into that.
Pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
So just give us a little bit of kind of the background story to start off with, Ash, before we get into that. Tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into coaching.
Sure. So I got into coaching basically to solve my own problem. So I had a recurring neck and shoulder injury from the age of 14 to 24, which is kind of on and off. It's a whiplash type injury, and it was bad, but not that bad. So I never had really long periods of time where I couldn't play, but I was in and out of physio constantly in that sort of injury rehab cycle. And I would do everything they told me to do. I would feel better, come back, and the issue would just reoccur. And after 10 years of this frustration, I started my corporate job. I was sat in the office, not doing my job, just browsing the internet. And I just started to think, this is now actually getting a bit frustrating. I'm getting a bit sick of doing the same things again and again, going through the same cycle. So I started doing my own research, trying to figure out what was really going on and if there were other approaches to try and address what was really going on, because I'd had MRIs, I'd seen surgeons, I'd spoken to all different types of practitioner, and no one could really make a significant change. And that's when I discovered functional fitness, where I discovered CrossFit and the idea of mobility training. So I went down the rabbit hole into all the Kelly Starrett, supple leopard stuff, which was great at the time. And it was kind of eye-opening to realize that there were people out there focused on movement quality rather than, I'd always been into the gym, but I think all the knowledge that was widely available was very much bodybuilding centric and, you know, muscle isolation and hypertrophy. And it was, a complete revelation to me, the idea that you could be training to move better and to perform better, which nowadays sounds so ridiculous that was actually not widely available. So I sort of was getting fed up with my corporate job and thought, I want to do something in this space. This is always what I've been passionate about. And I realized that there were people out there who had knowledge and skills that could address these sorts of issues, essentially movement mechanics issues. So the body wasn't working in the way that it wanted to work. And we need to get clear at putting in an input into the body to teach it to move better. And that's why the company is called the Training Stimulus, because essentially everything we're doing training-wise is trying to create a stimulus to elicit adaptation in the way that we want. That could be get bigger, could be get stronger, could be get leaner, but it could also be to improve your motor patterns and move more efficiently. So, flash forward, that was, 11 years ago now. I've sort of done as much research as I can, done a few different mentorships, done a lot of strength and conditioning courses to try and piece together my view on the way the body works and the way that we can speak to it in the language that it likes to get it to do the things that we want it to do. And yeah, now I'm fortunate enough to be teaching other people to do that and take a lot of joy in my students getting their clients great results to move better. So yeah, that's the whistle stop tour, I guess.
I love that. So even just the language you use around training, like for me, that was quite different. I'd not really heard of someone use that kind of language, like, you know, talk to the body, put this input in. For me, that kind of appealed to like the science part of my brain. So that was why, you know, when I first started consuming your content, I was like really, really drawn to it. And it helped me to understand a lot of things that I previously kind of, I feel like I knew, because it was like, I've done this for 7 years, 8 years, and I've seen this and I've evaluated it, and yeah, that works, but maybe didn't always necessarily know why at a deeper level. So yeah, you know, you do a fantastic job of that, and I'm sure we'll get to at the end. You know, please feel free to share the mentorship and all those details, because that is really valuable stuff.
Thank you.
So yeah, no, thank you, Ash. So yeah, we've got this problem at the moment in the industry. I mean, tell me what you see, what kind of trend has happened over the last few years that you see, and what is the issue that has arisen as a result of that, for females in particular, but definitely for some guys out there too.
Sure, I think it's just the way things are these days. Everything gets taken to an extreme very, very quickly. So as soon as a new idea enters the fitness industry, somebody just goes all in on it and gets obsessed with it and takes it to the limit. And because of social media, everyone's in this kind of arms race that I'm going to do it more than that person I saw online.
Yeah, so that's the fitness industry.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that now that fitness has become a sport, it's become a very confusing space, in that the health and fitness industry originally was about looking better and feeling better and hopefully improving some health markers. Then it became a sport, and it became about winning and competing. And they're actually very, very different goals. If you're trying to be as strong as possible, there will be an inflection point where your health and longevity actually is negatively impacted. Same goes for almost any athletic endeavor. Like, Olympians are not the pinnacle of health. They're the pinnacle of athleticism and performance. And there is a trade-off to be made when you are pushing your body to its absolute limit. And I think it's quite confusing for people nowadays, because the poster men and women that people look up to are these extreme athletes that are amazing in so many different ways, but aspiring to be like them can actually be counterproductive for the average person's goals, because they don't recognize that they might be a professional athlete. Their whole life is dedicated to their training, their nutrition, their sleep, their personal life is all sacrificed in the name of performing, whereas they're trying to hold down the job, might have a partner and kids and all the rest of it. So they're asking too much of themselves from a training and performance perspective, which ends up pushing them into a negative space rather than a positive space. So I think you can describe it as overtraining or under-recovering, or trying to do too much too soon. There's all different angles to view the same problem, which is essentially people asking themselves to be athletes without giving the requisite sacrifices elsewhere, or requisite trade-offs elsewhere, I guess.
Yeah, no, there's so much to unpack there. I love it. I love this conversation, because every single day I'm in that CrossFit box, I'm training clients, and you just want to shake people sometimes, don't you? I mean, let's kind of go back around to starting with fitness has become a sport, because that in itself is just such a great way of explaining it, because by definition, if now what we do is sport rather than going to the gym, then surely that makes us athletes, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that does clarify things, or should clarify things a little bit, in that if you look at other sports, people don't think of them as systems to be healthy and fit. Like, you might have some fitness because you play five-a-side football every week, but it's not a health system. It's not a way of you can lose some weight for sure, but it's not the way to improve your body composition. And it gets confusing, because in sports like CrossFit, some people do improve their body composition radically, but it doesn't mean that the competitive side of CrossFit is the way to optimally improve your body composition. There are a plethora plethora of other options available, which probably have a lot lower risk and might get you there faster. So one of the conversations I like to have with my clients is for them to make a personal decision on the sliding scale of where's their personal importance from absolute maximum competitive performance. Like, do you want to go to the CrossFit Games and sacrifice a lot to get every last ounce of performance out of yourself? Or are you here to live a nice quality of life and live as long as possible, be as healthy as possible? Everyone exists somewhere on that continuum, and you kind of need to make a choice on what's worth it and what's not worth it, because there will be sacrifices required to go towards that higher performance end as compared to going a little bit slower and potentially having better health markers rather than performance markers.
Yeah, no, that's so important. Is that for the people listening that are kind of trying to coach themselves through this process, and for the coaches listening as well, is that obviously a conversation you have right at the start when you work with a client, and is it something that you kind of reevaluate and check in on and see if it's changed along that coaching journey?
Yeah, for sure. Like in an initial consultation, that's one of the questions that I would put on my intake form, is just you get an idea of whether they've thought about it at all or they haven't, and it's the first time they thought about it, because it puts a lot of context around a lot of decisions. As in, say you're a competitive CrossFitter, there are certain movements you absolutely have to be able to do. Otherwise, you can't turn up to a competition because you won't be able to do an event. Whereas for somebody who's just training for general health and fitness, there are no movements that you 100% have to do. You can always find a variation or substitution to get the same training stimulus without having to do that specific movement pattern. So once they can see how that puzzle fits together, everything seems to make a little bit more sense. Whereas previous to that discussion, they might think that they have to do a snatch because everyone else is doing snatch that they see who does fitness. But the reality is, unless you're competing in CrossFit or weightlifting, you don't have to do a snatch. Like, if you want to, you can choose to do so, but just know where it fits in your list of priorities as to whether it has to be or not.
Yeah, it's pretty low down mine. Believe me, I try and avoid them because I'm not very good at them. Yeah. So yeah, no, that's spot on. People do need to have that conversation with themselves. But for those people that they're not, in their mind at least, they're not trying to be an athlete, right? They're not trying to take CrossFit seriously, but they are signing up to things like just local scaled comps, or they're doing Spartan races. They're maybe doing 10Ks, half marathons, high rocks, whatever it is, right? And this person, in their mind, they don't see themselves as an athlete, but they are signing up for competitions which involve them pushing themselves hard, training regularly, and having to do certain movements, specific movements, which then by definition makes them an athlete. I mean, what would you kind of say to that person? Because when we have that disconnect between identity versus what you're actually trying to do, obviously there's a series of knock-on consequences that occur from that.
For sure. I think if you're competing, you're an athlete, and I think almost everybody should view themselves as an athlete of sorts, in that you've got to look after the machine. You only get one body for your whole life, so you should be regularly maintaining it and looking after it as best as you can and preparing it for what you're about to ask it to do. So if you're going to ask it to compete and push yourself to your absolute limit, you have to have ticked a few boxes along the way. Like, everyone can kind of see that you shouldn't sign up for a marathon having done very little running and expect to come out of it unscathed. But
how dare you call me out like that?
Is that what you've done?
Sitting here with a knee injury. I feel personally attacked.
Yeah, but that's probably not the best preparation.
Oh yeah, it was stupid, but I did it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think that line of thinking doesn't get applied so well to these functional fitness comps, because they think, I go to the gym 3 or 4 times a week, I do fitness, now I'm going to go and do a 5-event day at this competition, and it's wildly beyond the typical ask of your body. Yeah. And the fundamental principle of training is progressive overload. The body slowly and steadily adapts to you asking incrementally more of it over a long period of time. And there is a rate that limits how fast you can adapt. You can't go from running 1 mile to 26 miles in a day. Everyone knows that. But if you build it up over time...
I didn't. I'm joking.
If you build it up over time, the body will grow, repair, adapt, and you will be able to run 26 miles. And some people can do it 4 times over in a day now. So we need to approach these competitions in a similar way, in that if you're going to go and do 5 events in one day, your training volume should have progressively built up, so that isn't a ridiculous system shock, because the system shock and the massive spikes in stress on the body is where injuries happen. Any injury is the tolerance of your tissues has been exceeded. You've asked too much of one specific structure, and the situations when that happens are when that structure hasn't adequately been prepared for the demand that you've placed on it, almost full stop. Like, you can apply that logic to even a car crash, right? If you had progressively built up car crash-like impacts, you would be able to tolerate a low-level car crash much better than somebody who hadn't. So even in those random chance accidents, the same stuff applies. But when we have a better idea of the demand on the body that's coming up, we can and should prepare the body for it. And I think Hyrox is a really nice example of this, where we're seeing a surge in Hyrox classes. Because we know what the workout is, we can prepare the body more sensibly, more progressively, build up, practice the movements, practice the weights, everything, practice your pacing. So by the time the race comes around, a lot of people are turning up actually in really good shape for the event, and I haven't actually heard of anybody coming out of a Hyrox competition with a serious injury, which I think speaks volumes as to the benefit of predictable programming in a competition. Whereas the opposite case is in functional fitness and CrossFit competitions, where you don't know what the events are going to be. It could be really heavy, it could be really fast, it could be lots of plyometric stuff. And you probably, unless you have been doing it for a really long time and have been really well programmed, it's very difficult to prepare your body adequately for these unknown challenges.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And that's why I'm quite happy to kind of push is not the right word. It's never my place to obviously push goals on clients. But when people are like, oh, should I work towards something? Sometimes clients do need a little push to challenge themselves. And I think Hyrox is brilliant for that, because obviously I can do exactly that. I can program for them in a way where they're not going to turn up and be put in a bunch of positions or exposed to exercises that are potentially going to, cause that risk of injury, where you do know exactly what the race is in advance, which I think, I've watched the Hyrox documentary. They don't talk about it in this sense, but do you think that's kind of part of the reason why they created it that way, so that people could have something which is predictable and they can train for? Like, is that kind of the angle they went for, do you think, versus CrossFit?
Yeah, 100%. So they did an event at WIT that I went to a while back with the founders, and that was one of the reasons they structured it like they did. Yeah, so I think one or two of the guys have a background in endurance events, so Ironmen or Ironmans, I can't remember which one it is, and marathons. So that's one of the bits of feedback that everyone gives, is that they're always really well run. Like, it's organized very well. The stations are all very well set up. The flow of people is very well organized, which I think comes from that event experience. But when they were thinking about an accessible functional fitness competition, they're like, right, we're going to pick movements that are a good test of fitness in our eyes, that everyone can do without having done tons of specific training, but it has to be repeatable, so that John in London can compete with Steve in Barcelona. And I think that is more like a marathon, right? In that individual courses vary slightly, but the overall task is the same. And it means that times can be comparable, which I think is a challenge in CrossFit, except for the benchmark workouts. If somebody wins event 2 at Strength and Depth in London, it's hard to compare whether that person's a better athlete compared to somebody who wins event 3 at the French Throwdown. And there's something nice about that, in that it's always new and always exciting, and there's a lot more strategizing that has to happen on the fly when you see a CrossFit workout come out. But in terms of cold hard facts, it's much easier to compare Hyrox scores